Well, welcome everybody. My name is Dave Cohen. I am a director here at Mina Partners. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you if you're listening to this live for spending a little time with us today. We have an exciting conversation queued up for you. We're going to be talking about the role of the Privacy Office in AI governance. And we'll get into that in just a minute. I'm going to introduce my friend and our guest here in just a second. But before we do, wanted to let everybody who is participating live know that we welcome questions. There's a comments section on your screen there. And if you want to post questions or comments in the chat, we'd be more than happy to recognize those and make this more of a robust conversation. So please feel free to introduce them. So with that, let me introduce our guest for today. Andrew Clearwater is Chief Trust and Privacy Officer at OneTrust, and a longtime friend. Andrew and I first met many years ago at the IAPP. Seems like forever ago. And following that, Andrew began working at OneTrust and has really progressed through the organization and followed some pretty amazing growth. He continued to innovate and grow and move up in the leadership group there at OneTrust, and we're going to hear a little bit about that today. And so with that, let me actually hand it over to you, Andrew, and talk a little bit about your journey over there. And it ties in very well with our topic of conversation today, which is both the kind of legal compliance aspect of AI governance as it relates to privacy governance, but also the operational aspects, because I know that you've overseen a number of important initiatives over there internally at OneTrust.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I've been growing with my privacy title for a while, and there are some advantages to having a history of doing that as we kind of look now at what we're doing with AI governance. I started out with the internal privacy program, but was also very early in the company, so had a lot of influence in how we addressed security as well. And so one of the things that was important about our approach was that I helped bridge the privacy and security controls initially and put them into what ISO calls an integrated management system. So
Mm-hmm.
we were kind of one program with common controls from a very early on, which made it a lot easier down the road because of course we'd been building on it for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
But it gave us, risk assessment and decision making capabilities that were combined. We were able to leverage the 27001 security program to get the 27701 privacy certification. And over the years, we better integrated ethics, which also became important
Mm-hmm.
when we started to face AI governance as a new issue. So these are all data issues. They all had many common controls. And I think my title change to include this concept of trust really helped me get more buy-in from the company and more buy-in from multiple departments to help with these sorts of issues. So it's more of a data-centric risk approach where you're proactively trying to manage these issues, and because of that, you have a little more flexibility on who you can call on, who you can work with. And to the extent that you're looking to kind of build your career, this can be a good way of kind of managing your title and scope because you can throw yourself in front of some of these issues and give some new ideas on how to approach them without having to really add to the head count, which is certainly a challenge that I think a lot of us are facing.
Well, thanks for touching on it, Andrew. Yeah, because that's something that we were talking about just before we went live here on the program. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about the AI governance regulatory landscape. But before we
Yep.
do, I wanted to just dig into that a little bit more, because one of the things that we were talking about is it's seemingly quite common out there right now for the Privacy Office and those charged with privacy compliance to be getting tapped to just add on AI governance compliance as well. And it's a common response might be, we're already under resourced. We already have a
Yeah.
lot to do. A lot of responsibilities on our plate, but now we're being asked to, add on another layer of responsibility, another layer of tasks to complete. So, but I really loved your response to that, which is not just, oh no, one more thing to do, but
Mm.
instead, how can I integrate that and grow myself professionally, my team professionally, and then therefore pull in more resources from the rest of the organization? You want to just talk just a minute about how that kind of played out on the ground in terms of additional staffing and being able to figure out what to keep and what to offload?
Yeah. I mean, there are some net new things that you're definitely going to need. And among that is, kind of new skills and training. So you can't, replace that with just the fact that you're working with new people. All of you will need access to new resources from that point of view.
Mhm.
But from the point of view of like, how do we start to address this problem? If you are asked from the privacy office to be a leader in determining what to do next, it makes a lot of sense to draw lines to other departments and reach out and say, let's look at what parts of this we can handle and what parts of it you can handle. We had the advantage of previously being mapped together, right? We, before seeing the AI governance issue, had put together connections between ethics, security, and privacy that were already robust, that already had committees. So for an example, when we had to have an AI governance committee, we were pretty sure who should be on it because we had seen comprehensive risks come up in the context of that previous program, and so
Mhm.
we knew who would be good to respond. So I think just like a lot of things, it's really about putting together the right people to begin with. And if you're the one who gets to select the committee and start making some of the initial calls, this will allow you to be in the position to make further calls down the line. And so it is pretty well known which types of skills would be useful. You definitely want to go into ethics and security, but don't forget to get into IT, maybe R&D, and some of these other areas for some of the initial calls. But then you're going to have to expand into some of the heavy users of this technology and probably some of the sensitive areas. But I would advise against going too wide too quickly.
Mhm.
You can always have meetings and you can always have decisions that involve additional people, but they don't have to be part of the genesis of all of these decisions, which can slow things down and make it more difficult to decide things. So I'm also someone who likes to use standards as a guide. And
Mhm.
I think later in the program, we can touch a bit on what those standards are and how they can help. But that can be very useful in the sense that privacy is often something that looks first to the law and maybe later to standards, just because of the nature of the kind of the compliance culture
Yeah.
of a privacy office. And so it might be uncomfortable or different for you to kind of head into a standard first and find out later what laws may apply to you in the future or be applicable through privacy. Rather than kind of your traditional approach that you're seeing in privacy. But that's good because some of your peers will actually be standards first people, like security. Security will really speak that language and be excited that you're speaking it, and that's one of the things that can bring you together.
Yeah, and we will get into this a little bit later, Andrew, as well. But you just made me think of here at Mina Partners. It's very common for us to a lot of our clients want to utilize the NIST work,
Yeah,
and a big reason for that. And early on, the NIST privacy framework when it was rolled out, and it's a great standard to look to. Part of the value of it is that because you're working with all of these folks in IT, they're very familiar with the NIST vernacular from the previously existing cybersecurity standards. So structure the same, a lot of the same nomenclature, et cetera. So it makes porting over the privacy framework and now the AI framework, kind of unified and it's a familiar language to those teams.
yeah,
Yeah. So let's before we get into that, and the other thing I also wanted to put a pin in making sure that we talk a little bit about the formation of standing AI governance committees, and what teams might want to be tapped for that, and what levels
yeah,
within the organization. But let's talk about that a little later. Let's take a step back, Andrew, and if you could just sketch out for us briefly the AI regulatory landscape for us right now. Now those of you listening know it's relatively early days in terms of actual implemented laws across the globe, but there are some, and they are in the books, and they are increasing. So it's definitely why there's so much buzz about AI right now, and something that everybody needs to keep an eye on. But can you just kind of sketch out broadly what's in place now, and what are the near term likely to pass and become compliance obligations soon?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to be aware of is that just because the law doesn't have AI in the title doesn't mean it's not going to regulate AI, right? And I think we know that, but it's good to give ourselves that reminder because
Mhm.
it's actually quite helpful that law is not technology centric in some ways. It becomes more flexible and more applicable.
Mhm.
And so we see things like Article 22 of the GDPR with automated decision making, or the CCPA with automating decision making rules. coming into play for some of the work that we do today, regardless of the fact that it's, and maybe not saying the words AI
Right.
right away. When you look at the federal area within the US, we don't have a comprehensive AI governance law in place, but we do have executive orders. We have blueprints for an AI Bill of Rights. We've got the Office of Management and Budget Guidance, and we have an FTC that has Operation AI Comply, underway as of September. So there's some activity going on that's definitely worth following. And then when you look at the states, what's important right now is essentially California, Colorado, and Utah. California really looking at 2026, the Transparency Act, as well as the Training Data Transparency Act, both of which are going to be relevant to a smaller, subset of the population. So let's not, treat it the same as CCPA or GDPR. You've got to look and see if you're in scope. But Colorado, their act has an effective date of February 1st, 2026. So that's going to be relevant, and that's really looking at developers of high-risk AI systems. And Utah, Utah has an AI Policy Act effective May 1st, 2024, and there's liability there for AI use not properly disclosed. That's really more looking at consumer protection. And I think you're going to see a theme of sort of like a product liability model coming up more often, and that's definitely what we've seen in the context of the EU. You should probably, if you're still kind of horizon scanning at this point, take a look at some of the more narrow state laws. Illinois has a Human Rights Act that is kind of in scope. New Hampshire has something that's specific to the agencies. Tennessee has something that's looking at likeness, voice, and image security. So you can really kind of start down a long tail that isn't too productive, but it is worth tracking. And we have some tools like the data guidance tool at OneTrust is a good dashboard. IFPP has a dashboard. There are many good dashboards that can make keeping an eye on all of these things relevant. And then, you can look to the EU AI Act, of course, in Europe, and now that's passed and being implemented over a couple year period. And then I'm keeping an eye on Canada as well, where there's a voluntary code of conduct at the moment. But there's always, the proposed Artificial Intelligence Act and Data Act that may or may not make it through, and several things that have been proposed at the provincial level as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks, Andrew. That's a really helpful overview. And for those of you listening, if you kind of want to go, track some of these down, a couple of good places for reference, as Andrew mentioned, are OneTrust's own data guidance library, and the IPP has some excellent resources to keep up to date on the latest developments in terms of AI regulations. And as always, that what many of us learned in the privacy professional journey, in terms of trying to comply with multiple laws, in terms of like the U.S. state patchwork, as they call it. A lot of the good news is that many requirements are similar, and if you set up some general controls internally, hopefully they will check boxes for a number of different jurisdictions and regimes, and then you can focus in on what is specifically unique to a particular piece of legislation if your organization falls within the scope of that law. So in a minute, I want to get to talking about building out your internal program and budget for that. But before we do, Andrew, when you talked about the currently in place regulations a moment ago, the word transparency popped up a couple of times, and it made me think about how when you and I were preparing for this, we talked a lot about transparency reports. Maybe this is a good time for you to talk a little bit about what is a transparency report. I know this is one of the major requirements that some of these regulations share. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, even if it's not a requirement, I think it's a good idea. And there's such a wide variety of versions of this that you can see. I think the first place to look is, of course, the large tech companies. They've got the biggest budgets, the most people, and they definitely have come through with, very good looking PDF documents that go through the principles and the activities, the program review, and even details about each service. One of the things that I've looked to do when kind of faced with something brand new like this is, well, where have there been similar things that have been required in the past? And what stood out to me is that, in the US, the financial sectors have had to do this for about a decade, but they were calling it algorithmic risk, right? And there
Hmm.
were teams that were putting together reports and really looking at similar issues. I mean, yes, maybe the risks were more narrowly defined, but what has come from some of that work is something that allows you to define something that's more akin to like a nutrition label around these things. And it is kind of being used, I would say, by the AI companies themselves when you look at like a model card, right? That concept of a card and the overview that you can have from it is really, a good one to get the key details quickly. So my recommendation would be, kind of look at the cards, look at what banks have been doing for a long time, and look at what the largest tech companies have put together, and start to figure out, what level of transparency you're comfortable with, and also know what problem you're trying to solve.
Hmm.
In a business to business context, some of the challenges you're going to have in selling software that includes AI is all of the questions that come up around how you're using data and what sorts of AI you're using and the risks that it might present. So everything that was exciting at the beginning of the sales process becomes dangerous at the end, right? So now, now you've got to kind of account for that. And so, to the extent that the velocity of the sale could stall around these issues, this is where you, as a privacy person who's taken on AI governance, can be, kind of a hero to make sure that things are okay and move forward. If you can show that this was being stalled, but then we put this, transparency report in place, and now that seems to be going away, there's less time being spent, it's going to further justify why these sorts of things can be shared and how. I think the counter to this is, the more you share about your business model, the more you share about exactly how you do things, there could be some discomfort about what that means in terms of
There's a
competition
balance
and,
to be
and all
struck
of
there
that.
for
Yeah.
sure.
So
Yeah.
don't go, all the way to one side and find out what happens with that. But that's why it's good to know what problem you're solving. If you've had 100 questions about AI, then you probably know that 10 of them are similar, and these are the types of questions you should be answering up front.
Mhm. Yeah, and that makes me think that having attended a number of conferences and sessions over the last couple of years, as many of us have, and listening to people begin to stand up AI governance programs within their organizations, that a couple of the key things that jump out as critical early stage tasks are just related to what you were talking about in terms of transparency, is just a documentation of what tools are being used within the organization, and just creating inventories and and indexes of
Yeah.
those, which will help down the road and can then be updated regularly as new tools come into play. But also importantly, that risk analysis that you mentioned, which is to say
Right.
that there are technologies, and by the way, good point, they go by different names. Algorithmic
Mhm.
decision making, is really
Yeah.
what artificial intelligence technologies are in a lot of ways. They The risk analysis is, does the output of the tool that you're using within your organization, is there a high risk to it or a low risk to it? If it's
Yeah.
trying to create some creative ideas for the internal office party, that may be a lower risk output that you don't have to worry as much about and dedicate very many resources to. But if you're making decisions that are going to affect your customers' lives, the classic examples being credit scores, or
Yeah.
things that really have significant real world decision making, which, by the way, all progressive companies are using these tools. You need to be very, very careful about understanding what went into the decision making, the technological decision making that produce these outputs. So pay attention to your highest risk outputs first. So that risk analysis is really critical, and that involves both the output and the input as well, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
want to be careful about what these models are being trained on.
It really goes back to that resource use question that we had at the beginning, which is, how do you scale up into this if you don't have a bunch of new people to help? Well, you've got to choose your battles, right? And so knowing that you've got the right tools to kind of narrow down what's important and what's high risk, that's a great way to deal with things. Put from the perspective of, someone that's got a lot of experience in privacy, think about PIAs. You don't
Mhm.
go out into the company and ask them to document everything fully because you'll never finish that task. typically the best approach would be to have a threshold questionnaire that allows you to identify, okay, this is risky, this is not. And by doing something either with that existing threshold assessment that you're already using, or just essentially making a new one that's going to be efficient enough that you get the key details, you know, pick that up, make sure that you're identifying what's important, you know, work on those first, get your wins, and perhaps that's what justifies the resources and tooling down the road to address even more.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, in a minute, I want to talk a little bit about how to obtain buy-in, support, and budget for these efforts. But before I do, really important to underscore what you just said for those out there listening, that any of you have been operating in a privacy office for any amount of time at all, know what assessments are and know what assessment fatigue is. So the worst way to increase assessment fatigue is to add more questions to your assessment and to overwhelm people and ask them to do even more than you're already asking them to do. So take the time to be really judicious with regards to, if you're going to kind of add in a few, as Andrew alluded to, trigger questions, just to see if those AI technologies are in use within the organization. Because, by the way, at any kind of small to medium-sized even organization, these technologies are going to maybe come in the side door, and you might not even know that they're being utilized by a department over there somewhere. So finding out where these technologies are being used throughout the organization is one of the major challenges, and being able to you find those out through these assessments is going to be critical. But don't overwhelm your audience when you're getting those out there. So that kind of layered trigger approach is makes a lot of sense.
I agree, and I want to add just one or two more things that I've kind of learned through doing this, which is that you know, keep in mind that you can embed these questions within the tools that people already use. So if you're in an organization like mine that's developing software, where are people planning that software? Where are they planning that they might include the usage of AI? A single checkbox that says I'm going to include AI might be enough information to kind of get you involved. And it's not that much work to get one checkbox added to a process to get things going for you. So sometimes it's even the little things that can get you some of the visibility that you need. And to go back to my point about, you know, the benefits of working with others outside of privacy, security is full of tools that can discover things that are in use within your company, and you want to, you know, use those tools in a privacy protective manner. But they often not only can find things, but they can rank them based on risk. Those risks may not be as robust as the ones that you'd want to look at if you really dug in. But again, if you're trying to generate a list and you want to work with others to generate that list, it's worth talking to your security colleagues and saying, hey, you know, what do we know about what we're already doing? So that you don't have to kind of blindly start moving through the organization asking questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Andrew. And this may be a good time to segue over to something we mentioned earlier, which is the idea of setting up some governance committees within the organization. So, you know, some obvious departments or business units that come to mind are IT for sure, 100%, legal, marketing, you know, business development and sales. What other what does the standing committee kind of look like from your standpoint in terms of who you'd want to have at the table at the highest level, kind of as you sketch out the strategy for your AI governance program within the company?
Yeah. And I think that's good to make a distinction between, you know, what are the high level decisions we're making that are strategic, and who needs to work on this every day or a lot of days. Because there's a lot that needs to be done with these assessments and the alerts that come in security and all of that, but that can be a different group. You know, that can be a group that's, you know, in a small chat or on the same assessments, and that's fine. All of that can be fed up to a group of individuals who's going to be kind of looking at the dashboards and making some choices, and based on that. I mean, given the speed of change, I think these committees should really be meeting at least quarterly at this point. Maybe monthly if you can stand it, but I don't know. There's a lot of meetings already in the world. Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't introduce that concept. But you know, I have found that, you know, the IT, the security, the privacy, and ethics people are already drawn to solving this problem and have a lot of things to say that are immediately useful. So that's important. I don't remember if you already said legal, but legal really does have a lot to say here, especially when it comes to your own terms, the terms of the contracts that you're signing, as you bring in the, what could be hundreds of vendors that have AI involved. And one of the things I've learned about each of these groups, as you meet and then go back to your kind of respective parts of the company, it's very useful to try to construct the playbooks that implement the advice and the strategies that you're coming up with in these regular meetings. So, our legal team, for example, they want to know, well, what's a reasonable range of terms that we should be looking at, and what's bad, what's not, what do we fall back to. And so that is kind of a nice bridge between the strategic committee and the people who are spending the time every day with a lot of material coming across their desk. If you don't build that bridge, then you might think you're setting a strategy, but it's not going anywhere. And it can't all be buried into policy. Some of it's got to be in some more constructive documents.
Yeah. And then since we're talking about that highest level strategic committee, Andrew, what are your thoughts about either your own personal experience within OneTrust or in conversations with colleagues about if someone is listening to this program right now and saying, gosh, I really want to do this work. I think it's important for my company, but I'm not sure I have executive level buy-in. What do I do? How do I get that? And let's say I ideally think, that it would really be a very wise spend to add some headcount to be able to have some people helping here. So either from the kind of executive buy-in perspective or the budget perspective, what are your thoughts on some ideas about how folks might go about kind of getting that support?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is really knowing how to define the problem. The need for governance is not self-evident to everyone.
Right.
And it probably doesn't come up as there's a need for governance. So is it going to be framed as risk? Is it going to be, framed as a way to enable sales? Is it going to be framed as a way to build trust in the brand? Or is it risk to reputation? That is something that you're going to know best based on your company and what's worked well in the past. The thing that I like to come back to is this context of the contracts that are moving back and forth between companies. That's a point that gets measured. That's a point where we can say how much time those things took and whether it's impacting sales. So if you can attach something to sales and income related to the company, I think that's the highest area of success. But moving back from that, reputation and other issues are also successful. I think the other thing to think about is what types of resources you're asking for in the beginning versus long term. Like, it might be really exciting to ask for people that would immediately be able to, join your team and have a long-term impact, but maybe the company is not clear on what those people would be doing and whether we're going to need them for all the years that you're saying. So I've definitely seen the benefit to reaching out to law firms, reaching out to consulting firms, and getting the program off the ground using sort of this initial boost of activity that comes from working with others outside of your organization who have visibility into how others are doing it, so it can be moved quickly. And so you get those quick wins. You don't have an ongoing cost that you have to be responsible for. So it's a little bit quicker to yes in that sense. And then having made good decisions up front, you can later show through metrics and other ways why it is that these other resources would be needed.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's something that we have a lot of experience with here at Mina Partners, as a matter of fact, being an outside consultant that gets brought in. And the engagements that have been the most satisfying that I've personally worked on are those where we've been brought in to help stand up what will ultimately be a long-term, sustainable, internally resourced program. So we can kind of come in, help get things set up, establish the key players, processes, the procedures, get the policies written, get everything in line between what's written in the policies and the notices, and then operationally in the back end. But then ultimately training up people within the organization to be able to maintain and sustain that over the long term is always our goal when we come in. So that's a good point. So there may be an initial capital investment, kind of a big effort of energy, time, and even money to stamp things up. But hopefully with that following, you've got a lower long-term, solid, sustainable compliance regime set up. So, well, we're running out of time here. We've only got a few minutes left in our half an hour here. So some final thoughts. Andrew, I know, again, in preparing for this, we talked a little bit about how I loved what you were saying about how there's been, for those that are being charged with taking on what might be seen as an additional burden or yet more work to do, there's perhaps kind of an intuitive response to recoil and fear this and say, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to learn about it. But alternatively, you were talking about a better attitude and a kind of a better approach and philosophy to embrace. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're not getting enough resources within a narrow area, then branching out into more areas can actually get you more access to what you need. It sounds, kind of counterintuitive because you're worried, like, I've got more obligations and I feel like it's not gonna, but you're not seeing yet where it's going to lead you, right? So all these connections to other groups and other people are really what's going to unlock some new abilities. And your ability to communicate that you're about data-centric risk and can handle multiple opportunities down the road that are going to come in, because there's themes that we see over the years, right? Like AI governance is amazing now, and something else will be really exciting in 2 years from this point. And so in order to take advantage of these moments in your career, you should try to embrace them, try to find a way to get over that fear, understand it, and turn it into an opportunity. One of the books that I read recently was called Co-Intelligence. It's by Ethan Mollick. And I mean, there's a lot of lessons that you can pull from it. But one of the basic things he says is, don't forget that AI is something that can help you, and use it. And by using it, you're going to learn from it. Don't fear it, understand it. And it's by that kind of perspective that you're going to be the most useful to the company, because there's going to be a lot of questions about how the AI can be used and what to do to enable it. And there's a lot of statistics that we're seeing coming out around, like, the amount that's being invested and what's being put in front of employees, but not a lot in terms of the training and enablement. And if you can get yourself in front of that, as well as might be the kind of the mitigating and the risk part, you're going to really be seen as unlocking value for the company, which is always what we're trying to do from the perspective of our roles.
Yeah, great. And then just to finish, Andrew, speaking of resources, I know you recently completed your IAPP AI governance certification, and that's another great resource that's out there, among others. So by participating in those kinds of certification training and then going through the exam and getting that certificate, you're not only going to gain that knowledge for yourself, but you're also going to be building up a group of peers, people to go to, professional peers that you can go to and support each other when you have questions and knowledge to be able to share and overcome challenges together. So, well, I think that's about it. We should really probably wrap up. Andrew, really very much appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your, I'm sure, busy day today to talk with us. So thanks for your time. And as you can see on the screen there, we're putting up contact information for both myself. Feel free to get in touch with me and Mina Partners if there's anything we can do to help you with any of these compliance challenges that you have. And Andrew has graciously made his contact information available as well. So Andrew, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week, and really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks so much.